We are about to experience something truly special. Our good friend Clay Jenkinson will treat us to a Chautauqua-style character portrayal. That is to say that he will be the character. This is not a one-man show like you've seen on Broadway. This is an unscripted performance informed by decades of scholarship that has taken him far beyond the textbooks, the popular books, and beyond the new Christopher Nolan blockbuster film as well. We will enjoy a performance, and then we'll have the opportunity to ask the character questions. Right at the end, Clay will break character, and we can ask Clay the scholar questions as well. I get to meet some pretty incredible minds in this job, but this one is particularly special. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome to the Vail Symposium, Dr. J. Robert Oppenheimer.
At 8:14 local time on August 6, 1945, a B-29 airplane flown by a man named Tibbets dropped an atomic bomb over the Japanese city of Hiroshima. I was at Los Alamos at the time. The reports came in slowly, but we learned that as many as 60,000 people had been instantaneously killed. And from burns and radiation over the next few weeks, perhaps 20 more thousand people. 3 days later, on August 9th, 1945, an atomic bomb of a different technology, a plutonium implosion device, was dropped over the Japanese city of Nagasaki. And though it did less damage to the infrastructure of that city, it appears to have killed as many as 70,000 people, more or less instantaneously. The Japanese later reported that up to 200 or 250,000 people had died from those two detonations. I am regarded as the father of the atomic bomb, and that is a description that I won't quibble with, except in this respect. If I had never been born, there surely would have been an atomic weapon, and it surely would have been used in 1945. The question I put to you tonight, and I will begin my lecture with it and end it later, is this: is the atomic bomb different from conventional ordnance in degree or in kind? In other words, is it just a very mighty and potent bomb, not fundamentally different from chemical bombs? Or does it represent a new era in human history? The Tokyo raids of the 9th and 10th of March 1945 were led by 334 B-29 bombers. They killed more than 100,000 people. They obliterated 16 square miles of Tokyo and left between 1 million and 1.5 million people displaced. So is the atomic weapon different from conventional ordnance in kind or just in degree? After the war, I became a kind of a celebrity, and I was asked to be on all sorts of committees, and I wanted to go back to teaching. I went back to Caltech hoping to resume my work on dark stars and black holes. But the phone wouldn't stop ringing. I was called upon to testify in all sorts of committees all over the United States, particularly in Washington, and I found that I could never have a private life again. But I went to see President Truman shortly after the war because I believe that unless we create international cooperation and a very responsible non-proliferation regimen in the world, that the Third World War will be fought with thermonuclear weapons, and the fourth with sticks and clubs and stones. Truman did not learn of the existence of the Manhattan Project until the day FDR died. On April 12, 1945, the great Franklin Roosevelt died. We were heartbroken at Los Alamos. We regarded him, although not a first-rank intellect, a man of the deepest sensibility. And we felt that if anyone could shepherd us through the new atomic age, it was FDR. And now suddenly he was dead, and his vice president, Harry Truman, a former haberdasher from Missouri, I mean no disrespect, was suddenly the president. And on that day, after taking the oath of office as the President of the United States, he was informed for the first time of the existence of the atomic program. Imagine the pressure on this man, who never had intended to be the President of the United States, and frankly, perhaps should never have become the President of the United States, suddenly taking on that burden and having to decide within weeks whether to use this device. I felt that he did not understand the fundamental revolution that had occurred at Los Alamos. And so in this meeting, after pressing him to take this more seriously, and he wanted to talk about whether Japan would ever get the bomb and all sorts of things, and he had particular concerns about Russia, he said they'd never get the bomb. I became so frustrated that I lost control of my temperament, and I said, Mr. President, we must do something. After all, I feel that I have blood on my hands. The president ended the meeting almost immediately. I was ushered out of the room, and he turned to his aide and said, never bring that fellow around here again. He may have built the thing, but I'm the person who set it off. And that was the day that my hope died for the post-war future of the world. I'm going to tell you the story of all of this. I need to keep it as concise as possible. I know you're suddenly more interested in this story than before, and I want to take as many questions as I possibly can. I was born in New York City in 1904 to a moderately wealthy Jewish family on the Upper West Side. I went to Felix Adler's Ethical Culture School in New York, and then on to Harvard, where I graduated in 3 years, summa cum laude. I had intended to major in chemistry, but I found physics more interesting, and philosophy. And so then I went off to Cambridge in 1925 and found that a little stifling, and then was shepherded off to Göttingen in Germany, where I took my doctorate from Max Born in 1927. This was the time when this extraordinary intellectual ferment was occurring all throughout the Western world. Picasso, Van Gogh, Stravinsky, T.S. Eliot, E.E. Cummings. It was a new era, and it coincided with the discoveries of quantum mechanics, because we used to think that the world was Newtonian, and in some respects it is. But in the very large and the infinitely small, it's not Newtonian at all. And what we discovered, a paradox which continues to make people perplexed and sometimes crazy, is that light is sometimes a particle, and sometimes a wave, and sometimes both and neither, and you can never know for sure. And this quantum indeterminacy drove Einstein mad. He said, I will not live in a world where God plays dice. And he spent the rest of his distinguished career looking for a unified field theory and never found it. When you get down to the subatomic, things are so confusing that they border on the mystical, which coordinates with Stravinsky and Eliot and Picasso and so on. I learned French to read Baudelaire in the original. I learned Italian to read Dante's Commedia in the original. I recited whole swaths of my favorite poet, John Donne, after whom the Trinity site in New Mexico was named. I learned Sanskrit because I wanted to read Hindu sacred texts, because maybe they, not being in the Western tradition, might help to unlock the secrets of the quantum universe. There's a reason that I never won the Nobel Prize for Physics, because I dabbled in so many other things. But I'm not at all sorry. I remember my friend Ferguson saying to me in Europe, "Oppie, you want to combine physics and poetry, it can't be done." And I said, "Just watch." And I made it work, at least for me. When I finished my PhD, I was offered posts at 10 universities in the US and several abroad. I chose to take a joint appointment at Caltech in Pasadena and the University of California at Berkeley. And I had the honor of bringing the first department of quantum physics to the United States. And I might have spent my life in just that way. But then Hitler invaded Poland. It soon became clear from refugee scientists from the Nazi world that Werner Heisenberg and others were working on an atomic device. And so I reckoned that we must understand this thing at least. And the government of the United States decided we must produce a bomb before Hitler could get it. And I just want you to think about for one moment what would have happened if Adolf Hitler had had an atomic device at Moscow or Stalingrad, or perhaps as a revenge weapon in the spring of 1945 against London. Does any of you doubt that Hitler would have used it? And the best physicists in the world were German. Fortunately, Hitler, because he was such a rabid anti-Semite, called the new physics Jew physics, and he allowed many of the physicists to leave the country and banished others. We became their place of refuge, and they helped us to get the bomb that was to defeat Hitler. Now, just so you understand how sudden all of this was, it was not until 1926 that Schrödinger disputed Bohr's idea that the atom had a planetary system, you know, the nucleus and then electrons spinning around it like the planets in the solar system. After all of his test readings, it's not at all. It's all confusion and waves and clouds and particles, and we don't know really what's going on, but it's not that simple. It wasn't until 1932 that the neutron was discovered by James Chadwick. No neutron, no atomic weapon. Because unless you have a neuter particle, you cannot penetrate the nucleus of an atom, and unless you can penetrate and split that atom, you cannot produce a bomb. The atom was first split in 1938 by Hahn and Strassmann in Germany. Niels Bohr first reported the splitting of the atom in 1939 at a conference in Washington, D.C. Plutonium, the heavy metal that produced the test at Alamogordo on July 16, 1945, and the second of the bombs, wasn't discovered by Glenn Seaborg until 1940. Think of how suddenly all of these things were falling into place. So what happened was, as you I'm sure know, that Leo Szilard, a Hungarian, terrified by what Hitler might do, drove out to Long Island to meet with Albert Einstein, and convinced Einstein to sign a letter that Szilard had written to the President of the United States, FDR, saying something like this: "Recent developments in physics have suggested that the atom can be split and would release enormous amounts of energy, and one application of this could be a bomb." When FDR received this, of course, he had other things on his mind. It wasn't until a number of months later that Alexandra Sachs, one of his closest friends, said, "Look, you've got to take this seriously." And then FDR said, "You're telling me, Alex, that if Hitler gets this, he could blow up the world?" Sachs said, "Precisely." It still took 3 more years before the Manhattan Project really got started. In October of 1942, General Leslie Groves was put in charge of the project. Groves was a huge, aggressive, hyper-masculine, bullying son of a bitch. One of the people at Los Alamos said he's the greatest son of a bitch I ever knew. Emphasis, great. He made no friends. He bulldozed over everybody. I was one of the only people that he constantly treated with respect. He didn't want the assignment. He had just finished building the Pentagon. He had built the Pentagon as a temporary office space in Washington, D.C. And he expected to be rewarded with a command in Europe or Asia. Instead, he was told that he had to do this project, and when he heard about it, he said, "Oh, not that thing." I'll give you a sense of his greatness. He got the assignment on October 16th, 1942. On October 18th, he took possession of 1,250 tons of uranium in New York Harbor that had been languishing there for 18 months from the Belgian Congo. A day later, he met with a man named Nelson, an Army officer in procurement, and said, "I'm going to need AAA designation for all of this project." In other words, the highest emergency, the top priority of all the things that the Army might build. And the procurement officer said, "There's no way that can happen. We have radar, we have ships, we have tanks, we have new airplanes. I can maybe give you A status or maybe AA status, but I can't possibly give you AAA status." So Groves said, "All right, there will be a letter on Franklin Roosevelt's desk tomorrow saying the project is impossible, and I'll be sure to mention that you said it wouldn't be able to get the status that it needs." He got AAA status. The next day, he took possession of 52,000 acres in eastern Tennessee, which became the Oak Ridge plant. A day or two after that, he went to Chicago to meet with Enrico Fermi to find out what a critical mass would be. Fermi was working on a pile there under Skaggs Field at the University of Chicago. And then on October 8th, he came out to Berkeley. And he wanted Ernst Lawrence, you know Lawrence, he's the great inventor of the cyclotron, the accelerator, but he's a lab scientist, not a theoretical physicist. And he met with Ernst Lawrence and he said, "Look, I need someone to direct this project. Will you do it?" And Lawrence said, "I can't. I don't have that capacity. You need someone with a theoretical background." And Groves flew into one of his usual rages and said, "Well, what am I expected to do?" To which Lawrence said, "Well, there's a guy down the hall that knows everything." And so Leslie Groves came to my office, and within an hour he had decided that I should direct the Manhattan Project. That was a snap judgment. Whether it was a wise judgment, I don't know. The first thing I said to General Groves was, "Look, I know how this needs to be done, although I've never organized a lab of any sort. The problem is that how should I put this? I have associations with almost every Communist Front organization on the West Coast. I'm guessing that will not pass muster with your security team." Groves said, "Let me handle that." And he pushed through my security clearance. And so now we recruited some of the best minds in the world to build this project. Groves wanted to have different cells in different cities, none of which could communicate with each other, so that no team would ever know what was really going on. This for security reasons. And I said, "No, that's not how science works. Science is an open door. It's the conversations around the water cooler. It's the late night evenings. It's the walks in the park. That's where scientific breakthroughs occur. If you split us up, it's not clear that we can build this thing." He said, "Then, well, where should we put this?" He thought of Reno, but it's too cold in the winter. San Bernardino, but it's too close to Los Angeles, and he feared that physicists would sneak into the city and divulge secrets. And I finally said, "You know, my two great loves are physics and desert country. I know a place down near Santa Fe, a mesa. There's a boys' school called Los Alamos Boys' School. What if we went there?" I had fallen in love with the Sangre de Cristo Mountains and bought a small ranch there. To my surprise, he agreed. He said, "How many people are you going to need?" I said, "Well, maybe 30 scientists and 100 others." It turned out we needed 300 scientists and 6,500 others to build the thing. And the big problem was that the mesa did not have an adequate water supply. And we never did. I want to just give you a sense of what we're trying to do here. The physics of atomic fission are pretty clear. Some of you probably know this. I will give you the very briefest demonstration. But it used to be thought that this was what an atom looked like, that it was hard, impenetrable, and it was the smallest particle that humans had, that everything in the universe was made from particles just like this in different combinations. What Schrödinger and others had proved is that no, not only is this not impenetrable, but most of it inside, 95 or 96% of it is just space. Think of that. The atom, which is so small that a microscope can't see it, is inside mostly dead space. It consists of many particles we now know, but the main ones are protons in its nucleus, which are a positive charge, electrons, which spin in clouds around it, and then neutrons, which combine with the nucleus. And once James Chadwick discovered the neutron, and Ernst Lawrence built the accelerator, you could bombard this atom with neutrons, and if one happened to hit the nucleus at the right speed, it would shatter it. And when it shattered it, this atom would devolve into several other elements, but neutrons, free neutrons, would be released, and they would go on to split other atoms. You remember Einstein said E equals mc squared. Energy is the same as mass times the speed of light squared. And when you split the atom, it devolves into several other elements, but several particles are converted into pure energy. And that energy is of enormous capacity. But it won't work unless you get a chain reaction. So one atom is exploded, free neutrons go out, split several more atoms, they split 4, they split 8, they split 16, and suddenly you have almost unbelievable amounts of power. Sounds easy, doesn't it? Here's the problem. First of all, you have to have the ore. And uranium was the principal ore, a heavy metal that has 2 isotopes. Now, an isotope is identical to its brother chemically, but different in mass, if that makes sense. So most uranium, which is the metal that we use, is called uranium-238. That's the addition of the protons and the neutrons in the nucleus. But there is a lesser isotope that freely mingles with U-238 called U-235, and because it's U-235, it's inherently unstable, and that's the one that you want to fissure. Here's the problem. Even if you can get the uranium, the proportion of U-235 to U-238 is 1 to 300. And you have to remove the U-235 from the U-238, or you don't have a fissile mass. And how do you separate those things? Because chemically they're identical and there's no chemical way to separate them. And so there are really 2 methods, and I won't go into great detail, but one is a cyclotron or an accelerator, and you spin atoms of both 238 and 235 faster and faster and faster, and finally the U-235 has a lesser orbit than the U-238, and they begin to go into different channels. Oak Ridge in Tennessee was designed for that. The plant that we built there to do this was larger than the Detroit auto industry. And it worked day after day, week after week, month after month, and even as late as February 1945, it had only produced about a golf ball-sized bit of fissile material. The energy required for those cyclotrons was greater than that would feed Memphis. And all that grinding produced a tiny amount. Fortunately, Glenn Seaborg discovered plutonium, and plutonium is easier to manufacture and it takes less to create a bomb. And so we're working on parallel systems. The problem with plutonium is that when it goes critical, it tends to fizzle out. It's called pre-detonation. So uranium is a better weapons material, but it's harder to produce. Plutonium is more readily available, but it's harder to make explode. 95% of everything we did at Los Alamos was trying to solve this problem. We were waiting for the fissile material, and once we had it, the question was, you know what a chain reaction is. I've been trying to explain it a little bit. You have to keep 2 subcritical pieces of uranium apart, If you bring them together, they don't explode, but they produce intense radiation. So you have to keep them apart until you need them. And when you need them, you have to put them together within 1/1,000,000th of a second. And then you have to hold them there long enough so that they don't just fizzle out. This was almost impossible to accomplish. Plutonium fizzles even more easily. And we realized that we couldn't fire them as in a cannon, that's what we use for the uranium. We would have to use something else that would be an implosive method. So think of a soccer ball with all of its lenses, and each one is a bomb or a small piece of explosive. They have to be imploded simultaneously to squeeze this piece of plutonium so that it goes from being subcritical to critical in less than 1/1,000,000th of a second. Seth Nettermeyer, who was in charge of this at Los Alamos, said, "Oh, I see, this is pretty easy. It's like taking a beer can and entirely making it disappear without spilling any of the beer." Most of what we did was to solve these two problems: gun mechanism for the uranium, implosive lenses for the plutonium. And as late as 24 hours before the test at Alamogordo, I got a call from Los Alamos saying the latest implosion tests did not work. If the Trinity test had been a dud, $2 billion would have been lost. The Army probably would have pulled the plug on the project. It would have been the end of Leslie Grove's career, and certainly would have done no good for mine. Fortunately, it worked. Say a word about Los Alamos. Isidore Rabi, who was one of my close friends and eventually came to work on the project, said that he didn't want to come there because it was surrounded by concertina wire and chain link fence and towers and watchtowers. He said, "I don't think that the culmination of 3 centuries of physics should end in this." We had a band of 19 pieces. We had an orchestra, a small, low-watt radio station. We did musicals and skits and charades. We had a cinema. There were many, many, many babies born there. Leslie Groves came to me one day and said, "Why are so many babies being born here?" And I said, "Well, guess, the average age was 25. Most of these were bachelors, men and women." He said, "Stop it. Make sure that no more babies are born here." Those who were there have said in their memoirs that those years were probably the best single years of their lives. We were working 17, 19, 20-hour days. One time, Leslie Groves, who called us the long hairs, who said, "At great expense we have gathered the largest collection of eggheads ever." He said he saw at lunch that day 5 Nobel laureates eating bologna sandwiches at a picnic table. And so you can imagine that of all the other things I had to think about, managing these colossal intellectuals, some of the greatest minds in the world, everyone thinking he's the most brilliant person of the 20th century, especially Edward Teller. Their egos, their narcissism, their easily hurt feelings, the squabbles, the backbiting, the threatening to leave the project. Most of what I had to do was hold this set of great men, these eccentrics, together. And I was able to do it. We had, Feynman. You've heard of Richard Feynman. He was the merry prankster at Los Alamos. For example, he was a genius too. He would go into people's offices late at night and crack their safes, and then put secret documents on their desks and leave. And they'd come back the next morning and there'd be secret documents on their desks and they'd have no idea how they got there. He also used to leave through the gate and then circle around and cut a hole through the perimeter fence and come back through and come out through the gate and say goodnight, and then circle around and come back again until the guards arrested him. So it wasn't all work and it wasn't all pain. Can we get the material? Can we enrich the material to bomb grade? Can we solve the detonation problem of either the gun mechanism for uranium or the implosive method for plutonium? Assuming we can do all that, and it tests well, can it be made portable? It'd be one thing to make it in a room this size, but if you're going to put it in a B-29 bomber, it has to be about the size of a Volkswagen. So can it be portable? And then finally, can it be perfected in time to affect the outcome of the war? Harry S. Truman wanted to be able to mention this to Stalin at Potsdam, the great meeting of the Big Three in broken Germany at the end of the war. And so we were forced to rush ahead in the spring of 1945. Groves wanted the test on July 4th. Eventually it was settled for July 16th. It was about 200 miles south of Los Alamos at a place called the Valley of Death, the Valley of the Journey of Death. An extraordinarily beautiful desert. We built a 110-foot tower there. We had observation stations and so on all around it. The bomb was brought in different attaché cases, different parts of the subcritical mechanism. The weather was ominous and thunderstorms were coming. There was such pressure to get this test made that we were all a nervous wreck. Leslie Grove was browbeating absolutely everybody. The weatherman said he couldn't guarantee that there would be clear skies in the morning. And Grove said, if they're not, I'll hang you. I was chain smoking 10, 15, 30 cigarettes per hour. I said at one point, oh Lord, how hard these affairs are on the heart. We had no idea whether this would work. We assumed it would, but we couldn't be sure. The weather cleared just a little, and then at 5:29 a.m. on July 16th, 1945, one of the world's first countdowns occurred. Earlier than that, I had gone up the evening previous. I'd climbed up the 100-foot tower and gone to sit next to this bomb. I wanted to make sure all the plugs were properly attached. I wanted to have a moment alone with this thing. And I thought, this is Prometheus, the Greek god who stole fire from the gods and was punished forever by having his liver eaten by birds. I said, we are playing with Promethean fire here. We're playing with the very levers of the stars. Nobody's ever done this before. We have no idea, A, will it work, or B, will it blow up the whole world? There was a betting pool about whether it would ignite the nitrogen in the atmosphere and destroy at least New Mexico. We literally didn't know. But this is the first time, all through this project, I'm handling egos. I'm getting materials. I'm solving problems of the water supply. We're encouraging Hanford to get us plutonium and Oak Ridge to get us uranium. The implosion lenses failed again and again and again and again. All that time, all of our minds were 100% absorbed in the thing we were trying to produce. It left us no time to think about what the implications of it were. We just wanted it to work. And then Sam Allison, holding a metallic microphone, said 5, 4, and then he realized when it goes off, there might be lightning strikes, so he said 3 and threw the microphone across the room. And at 5:29:45 a.m., the world's first atomic explosion occurred. There was a flash of light, blinded all of us, followed much later by the sound and the atomic wind. The cloud rose to 38,000 feet. It was seen in 3 states. There was a girl who had been born blind and was on her way from Santa Fe to Albuquerque for a piano lesson. She was in the back seat of a station wagon. And when it happened, she said, I saw something. What was that? She saw for the first time just a glimpse because of the brightness of the thing. Later that day, as we were driving back towards Los Alamos, 200 miles to the north, we ran into a local rancher. We had, of course, kept the project entirely secret. And there had been a lot of speculation about what we were doing. He said, "I don't know what you guys have been doing up there, but the sun rose twice today." When I saw this happen, this is what I thought. Some laughed, some cried, most were silent. I think we all knew that the world would never be the same again. I remembered a passage from the Hindu sacred text, the Bhagavad Gita, when Vishnu, the god, is persuading the prince to do his duty, and he takes his multi-armed form and says, "I am become death, the destroyer of worlds." I said, I think we all felt more or less that. I was on a siting committee, and the question became, now that Germany was done, Hitler had committed suicide at the end of April, the war was over, and remember, the bomb had been specifically intended to anticipate Adolf Hitler, not necessarily to use it, but to have it as leverage against Hitler using it. Now that he was dead, the scientists who had been working on this assiduously for several years had second thoughts about it, and there was a petition between 50 and 70 of the most eminent physicists in the country saying, we should not use this bomb. We don't need it now. It should not be used on Japan. It was never intended for Japan. And besides, Japan is finished. I was on the siting committee. We met many times, and we tried to steer a course between an ethical understanding of what we had done and the needs still in the war. Because, as you know, we were about to invade the main islands of Japan, and estimates were between 50,000 Americans would die in that invasion, up to 1 million. So I was on the siting committee, and this is what we decided, and I know I've taken a great deal of criticism for this. But I said, first, we should use it on Japan, because it will hasten the end of the war. But also, this thing is so gargantuan, so profoundly destructive, that the world will not know to step back from the brink unless we show the world what it can do. In other words, if you bomb a place like Hiroshima and the world realizes to its utter horror what this means, that's one chance for us to back away from this precipice. But if we hadn't used it against a population, who knows? There was a movement to have a demonstration bomb at some atoll in the Pacific. But I opposed that. I said, first of all, what if it's a dud? This will only increase Japanese resolve. But secondly, if you blow up an atoll, you've blown up an atoll. You don't have any idea of its destructive capacity. And then I said this, and I know this has been heavily criticized. I said, it needs to be dropped unannounced on a Japanese military facility, but one surrounded with a large civilian population. Why? Because if you just dropped it on a tank factory, it would destroy it, but you wouldn't know the potency of the thing. You have to be able to have a big enough population to see the perimeter of its destructive capacities. No warning, no demonstration, on a city with a large civilian population. I've wrestled with that every day for the rest of my life. The only justification for it, in addition to hastening the end of the war, will be if humanity sees this specter and determines not to open the seventh seal and bring on a nuclear apocalypse. Why Hiroshima? Because it had enough unbombed places to destroy. Most of Japan had been leveled. And so Hiroshima was intact, August 6th, 1945. 3 days later, a little precipitously. It wasn't intended to be dropped until the 11th or the 13th to give the Japanese time to decide what to do. But there was bad weather coming, so the Army Air Force pushed forward by 3 days, and it was dropped on August 9th. And you might say that it's unlikely that the Japanese ministry had time enough to really evaluate what had happened in that time. The first bomb was a uranium gun mechanism bomb, worked wonderfully. The second bomb was a plutonium implosion device, equally potent. Nagasaki was not the first on the list. The first on the list was Kakura, but the weather was cloudy there, and so the target was moved to Nagasaki. Japan surrendered almost immediately. But we now know, and I knew just a few years later, that Japan was already planning to sue for peace. The only thing they insisted upon was that they keep the emperor. We demanded unconditional surrender. That's why they wanted to fight on. And when they finally did surrender, we let them keep their emperor. And so they may have been willing to surrender without the use of either of these weapons. We don't know. We can't know. And Truman said, and I think that it is a fair thing, that if he saved one American life, he had to do it. That if he had not used this weapon and had not hastened the end of the war, he would have to answer to all of those mothers who wondered why a weapon in our arsenal had not been used. After the war, as I say, I became a kind of a celebrity. I was on every committee. I was on the Atomic Energy Commission's committee. And then came Edward Teller's hydrogen bomb. So the atomic bomb is a fission bomb. It explodes an atom and unleashes all of this energy. A hydrogen bomb, a fusion bomb, fuses elements and releases essentially an infinite amount of destructive power. At the very least, a fusion bomb is 1,000 times more potent than an atomic device. 1,000. Atomic device killed 60,000 people instantly in Hiroshima. Imagine a fusion device, the H-bomb, the super, the Zupa, as Teller called it. So when this was being debated, I didn't oppose it, but I said if an atomic bomb can take out absolutely any military facility on Earth without a single exception, then what's the use of a hydrogen bomb? The answer is it can only be seen as a genocidal weapon. It's a terror weapon. And I said, we may have to produce this, because Russia surely will if it can. And as you know, there were spies in our atomic program. But I said, is it in the interest of the United States of America to be the first to build this weapon whose only justification is genocidal? And because of that, because I was lukewarm on the super, this was the McCarthy era, of course, I was regarded as impeding with my charisma the national security of the United States, because it was thought that I had undue influence on young scholars, which is largely true, but it wasn't something that I attempted to do. They asked me my opinion, I gave it, and they often followed it. Teller was never okay with this. Teller thought that I was opposing the hydrogen bomb because I was envious of him. I had held him up on some of his favorite projects at Los Alamos. I kept saying to him, we've got to have the atomic bomb before we can do anything else, and he would never stay focused. He was maybe the smartest man there. But the darkness in his soul, the paranoia, boded ill for the future of human freedom, I think. So by opposing a pell-mell rush to a hydrogen bomb, I was regarded as a security threat. And my enemies in the military-industrial complex banded together. In late 1953, my security clearance was suspended. I chose to contest that, and then in a hearing in April and May of 1954, before 3 panelists chosen by the Atomic Energy Commission, I was put into the most humiliating and intrusive trial of my life, something worthy of Stalin. I can hardly even stand to talk about it. My lawyers were not allowed to have security clearances, so they never saw the documents that were being used against me. My phones were tapped throughout the trial, and conversations with my attorneys were routinely transcribed. Roger Robb, who was the prosecutor for the Atomic Energy Commission, spent 2 weeks before I ever appeared prejudicing the case with the 3 panel members, going through all of the potentially bad evidence, page by page. You know, in a trial, there's deposition and discovery, and you're allowed to have the documents that seem to incriminate you. I was not allowed to have them. Secret recordings had been made of me throughout the years doing routine investigations, to which I had never known of their existence and now was not privy because we were not allowed to see this evidence. And so they would catch me in small discrepancies in my descriptions of things because this was 12 or 15 years ago on the other side of Los Alamos. In short, although they said it was a hearing only, it was used as a show trial, and it was deliberately rigged to marginalize me and remove me from the center of atomic life and destroy me if necessary. No historian doubts this. And I had to sit there as they excavated my life, and 2 incidents in particular, perhaps you know of them. I was married in 1939 to a woman named Kitty, but before that, in 1936, I had had my first real romance with a woman at Berkeley named Jean Tatlock, a graduate student. She was a communist, or thought so. She was certainly a leftist. She was involved in life, and I wasn't. I can hardly even describe my childhood. I was such an unctuous, coddled, protected young genius. No, truly, at 11, I wrote to one of my cousins and said, "Ask me any question and I will answer in ancient Greek." I was a repulsive young man in every possible way. I gave my first learned paper to the New York Mineralogical Association when I was 12. I sent in a proposal. They invited me to come. When I came, they found a 12-year-old. They expected someone in his 40s. I was so hothoused, so coddled, so protected from life, that at Berkeley, when I was teaching there in 1929, it wasn't until 6 months later that I learned of the stock market crash. I didn't have a radio. I didn't take newspapers. I was just a brain delivery system, totally dedicated to Baudelaire and to quantum mechanics. And then Jean Tatlock came into my life. And the first real woman of my life. And I won't go into the details, but she awakened me sexually. She awakened me to the problems of capital. She told me about the workers in the Central Valley who hoed lettuce and picked grapes, and the trade union issues in the Bay Area, the censorship. She got me involved in several organizations that turned out to be communist front organizations, but we were all communists then. This is before Stalin ruined the idea of communism. She was an unstable woman, and I'm sure I didn't make her life any easier. We were nearly engaged twice, and then I broke it off, married Kitty. But in 1943, in June 12, 1943, when we had already resettled at Los Alamos and the project was well underway under the tightest security, I got a call in my office from Jean Tatlock saying she needed to see me. So I took the train back to the Bay Area, and I may as well admit this, since it's in the public record. I spent the night with her in a hotel in San Francisco. And of course, several security cars were outside recording all of this. This was, in my opinion, not a security breach, but you can imagine that I suppose I could have been blackmailed under certain conditions and so on, and it wasn't good for the moral high ground of our project that its director be an adulterer, since I was married. I would do it again because she was desperate, psychologically in real need, and I had promised her I would never fail her in such an instance. The other incident you may have heard about too, in the spring of 1943, just about the time we were going to the Mesa, we had a drinks party at my house. I was famous for my martinis. And a language professor friend of mine from Berkeley named Håkon Chevalier came into the kitchen and he got me alone and he said, "Oppie, I don't know what you're doing down there and I don't even know where you're doing it, but I know it's war-related." He said, "There are some people in San Francisco who have connections to the Soviet government, the Soviet embassy, and they have approached me and said that if there's anything that you think we should share with our ally, the Russians, I would be willing to facilitate that conversation." When he said that, I turned and gave him what's known as the blue glare treatment. And I said, "Never mention this again. This conversation did not happen. This is treason. I'm not going to tell you what we're doing. I have no interest in talking with the Russians or facilitating any exchange of information. That would have to be a decision made at much higher levels than mine. It was irresponsible of you to do this. You have compromised me and yourself. But let's pretend this never happened, since it's essentially innocent. But this should never, ever be discussed again." And Chevalier understood that and apologized. Well, a few months later, I decided that I must divulge this to the security people, because this is a potential breach of national security. And so I went to them and said, "I think you should watch out for a man named Eltington who's involved with British Shell in San Francisco, and that's all I want to tell you." And the security people said, "No, that's not enough. We need to know how you know this information." And so over many months, with the greatest reluctance, trying to protect Chevalier, who was clearly just an innocent do-gooder, he had no nefarious energies in his soul. But to try to protect him, I refused to divulge his name. And finally, Leslie Grove said, "I am now ordering you to divulge it." And then I did. And it shattered Chevalier's life. He was fired, of course, from Berkeley. Investigated over and over again, barely escaped prison. And he was just this sweet, innocent man wanting us to help win the war. So when the security clearance hearing occurred in April of 1954, these things were thrown back in my face. And my wife Kitty was sitting next to me as I talked about Jean Tatlock and Chevalier. It's like being publicly eviscerated. And remember, Groves pushed through my security clearance and said, "I'll vouch for this fellow." Anyway, they had documents that related to interviews that I had done 6, 7, 12 years earlier, and they had them in front of them, but I didn't have them. And so they would catch me out in small discrepancies and say, "I see you're lying, Dr. Oppenheimer," when I didn't know what I had said in those previous interviews. At one point, several discrepancies in the Chevalier story were put in my face, and Roger Robb, who was this bulldog of a prosecutor, said, "Explain this, Dr. Oppenheimer." And I said, "I don't know, I was an idiot." And there was a hush in that room. And he went home that night, in spite of the fact that he despised me and wanted me destroyed. He went home that night and said to his wife, "Today I have watched a man destroy himself." By a vote of 2-1, my security clearance was stripped. I had been named the director of the Institute for Advanced Study at Princeton. I was barely able to keep that job. And then I lived the rest of my life. The man who had created the atomic device was no longer permitted to know atomic data. In 1963, Jack Kennedy decided that it was time to rehabilitate me And so he encouraged the government to give me something called the Enrico Fermi Award, the highest award that the United States government can give to a physicist. $50,000 tax-free, a fortune then, and enormous prestige. I accepted the award. The award was to be put into my hands by the President of the United States on December 2nd, 1963. You know, Jack Kennedy was a sort of man after my own heart, hard-drinking, lover of women, lover of bohemian literature, lover of fine art. And then there's LBJ. But you know, LBJ was a man of greatness too. And when he gave me that award on December 2nd, 1963, he said this. He said, "I think this was one of Jack's fondest hopes." And that was an extraordinary moment. Teller had won it the previous year. He was there, he shook my hand. He had helped to destroy me during the security hearings. You remember what he said. He came in and pretended he was reluctant to testify and all of that. He said he was pretty certain I was a loyal American. He had no doubt about that. But he said, you know, Dr. Oppenheimer does things which are sometimes confused and perplexing to me. And all things considered, I would rather have our atomic secrets in the hands of somebody that I understood better. Well, that is assassination by innuendo and faint praise. When he got up at the hearing, he came over and shook my hand and said, "I'm sorry, Oppie." And I said, "From what you've just said, how can you possibly be sorry?" So when I won the award in 1963 and he came up to shake my hand, I did, because one does. This is a public event. But my wife, Kitty, she stared him down until he shrank out of the room. And she never, ever forgave him. I continued my work at the Institute for Advanced Studies, and I might have just passed on without any particular public notoriety, except that on January 4th, 1955, so 9 or 10 months after the security hearing, Edward R. Murrow of CBS did a 30-minute documentary on me for something called See It Now, black and white. He came to the Institute, interviewed me for a while, 3.5 hours, and they whittled it down to about 30 minutes. It changed everything overnight. I became a kind of a national cult figure. CBS had expected to be bombarded with hate mail. Instead, there were people saying, "We need to know more about this man." I had been blocked from giving lectures in all sorts of universities. Visiting lectureships and appointments had been denied me at the last minute. But I was to go to Portland State in Oregon, and after See It Now, they had planned to put me in a small seminar room, and then they moved it to a room like this, and then they transferred it to an auditorium, and finally to the field house. And more than 10,000 people came to hear me talk about quantum mechanics. One woman who was there, a young woman, was interviewed afterwards, and they said, "What did you learn?" She said, "Well, he's the most fascinating thing I've ever seen in my life. I didn't understand one word he said." And I became this sort of figure, this sort of cult figure, a kind of wonderful spiritual rehabilitation after all of that. I want to take your questions, but let me just say a couple of more things. One thing about science. You know, I spoke about the moment when the Trinity test succeeded. Enrico Fermi, you've probably heard of him. He's the man who produced the first sustained chain reaction in Chicago. He was several miles from the detonation, and just before it went, he thought, I think I have a way of measuring its power. So he took a little sheet of paper out of his pocket and tore it up into tiny bits, into confetti, and he waited for the atomic wind to come, and when the wind reached him, he dropped it. And those pieces of paper drifted down with the atomic wind, and then he took out of his back pocket his slide rule, and within seconds he determined that the yield was about 20,000 kilotons which was spot on. That's science. That's pure science. I said, I am become death, the shatterer of worlds, and he measured the kilotonnage. You see the difference. And you see why in some circles I was regarded as too complicated, too nuanced, too damaged by the humanities to conduct that sort of scientific enterprise. So I began by saying, I wanted you to think about this, whether the atomic weapon is different from other ordnance in degree or in kind. I think the answer is in kind. And I said the only way the world will survive is if we never have another world war. And as I left Los Alamos, I said, if we normalize this weapon, this was October 16th, 1945, if we normalize this weapon, the day will come when the world curses the names Los Alamos and Hiroshima. The only chance we have is somehow to mature as people, to make the UN what FDR wanted it to be and Eleanor, to create true communication between the great powers, to trust, to let science be open in the world, to share our secrets and not husband them, not to start off an arms war. Yes, I get it that human nature is not particularly honorable in its history, but they didn't have nuclear devices either, did they? You know, the bombs that nearly destroyed Tokyo on the 9th and 10th of March 1945 were conventional bombs, 344 planes. You could never destroy the world with them, no matter how many thousand B-29s you sent out. But this device, and especially if you give Teller his super bomb, can actually mean the end of life on the planet. I repeat, it can actually mean the end of human life on the planet. Are we mature enough for this? Because there is no weapon in human history that has not been used in extremity. There's no weapon in human history that has not been normalized in extremity. I remember, naming the Trinity site after a poem, a holy sonnet by John Donne, batter my heart, three-person God, for you as yet but knock, breathe, shine, and seek to mend, and so on. But I can think of a better one. In London in the Renaissance, in the Elizabethan era, there were no newspapers. There were barely any town criers, and so the news was really passed on in parish churches. And when the bells rang, that meant either there was a church service or a wedding, depending on the type of ringing. But it also meant, in a certain way, that someone had died. And so when you heard the bell, you sent one of your household servants, go find out who's dead. John Donne, the great British poet and Anglican preacher, nearly died of a fever in 1623, and he wrote a book called Devotions Upon Emergent Occasions. And in Meditation 17, he said this. Remember that bell. He said, the bell doth toll for him who thinks it doth. And though it intermit again, yet from that moment that sound came upon him, he is united to God. No man is an island entire of itself. Every man is a piece of the continent, a part of the main. If a clod be washed away by the sea, Europe is the less, as well as if a promontory were, as well as if a manor of thy friends or thy own were. Every man's death diminishes me, because I am involved in mankind. Therefore, never send to know for whom the bell tolls. It tolls for thee. Thank you very much. Please. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Please, you're making me feel like a cult figure again. So we'll take some questions. This fellow, I think, has a microphone. Raise your hand. Please be brief. Then you'll tell me when, but I'll stop being me and talk about this as a scholar if you have questions along those lines.
Please speak directly into the microphone and stand if you are able, and we'll start right up front.
Sir.
I'll address you as Oppie, is that right?
You may, although most people didn't.
Dr. Oppenheimer.
Yes, thank you.
Do you feel like that Louis Strauss' attack on you was more personal, political, or both?
Yes, the question is about Louis Strauss, spelled Strauss, pronounced Strauss. He was the commissioner of the Atomic Energy Commission, and we had a run-in at a hearing in the early post-war period, and I had appeared to belittle him. I will admit that I had something called the blue glare treatment. I did not suffer fools, and I was capable of having a very cutting manner. And so I probably brought some of this on myself, and I ridiculed him about isotopes. We were going to share isotopes with Norway and other nations. And I said, you could make an atomic bomb with a can of beer, you could make an atomic bomb with a shovel. And he turned beet red, and it's clear that he never fully forgave that. But the question is, what agency did he really have in my fall? And the answer, and I know your film makes it seem as if he's a bigger figure than he was, and I wouldn't pretend not to give him his due, but I think although he hated me and wanted me gone, I was going to be eliminated from my security clearance anyway. And it was because the Cold Warriors, think of Curtis LeMay, or Truman for that matter, or McCarthy, were determined that nothing was going to get in the way of the United States developing a hydrogen bomb. And it was perceived that I had been lukewarm and maybe worse on this subject, and so I needed to be marginalized. And I think that would have happened if there had been no Louis Strauss. He also was the chairman of the board of the Institute for Advanced Studies, and he tried to get me fired from that too. But I was able to hold on to that, thank goodness, because otherwise I would have been a man without a country, and in many respects was. But I think your film, if you want my reaction, gives too much credit to the Strauss vendetta. He was a petty little man. He truly was a petty little man. But he wasn't powerful enough to destroy me.
Dr. Oppenheimer.
Sir.
I was wondering if you could expound a little bit on your relationship with Edward Teller during the Manhattan Project.
So Edward Teller during the project. So Teller is Hungarian. You've seen those giant bushy eyebrows and the thick accent, and he was drop dead brilliant. There may have been nobody. I mean, these were some of the greatest minds on earth. There was probably nobody for sheer intelligence equal to Edward Teller. But I couldn't keep him focused. He wanted to build the super, but you can't build a super unless you have an atomic bomb first. And I said, one thing at a time. He was always threatening to quit. He hated Hans Bethe and everybody else who was in his way. He wanted to have a team of people to work on his private projects. Well, this is a government wartime emergency mission. Finally, he just said he was leaving, he was quitting, he couldn't take it anymore. And so I said, well, I'll meet you once a week for a private hour. I'll give you one or two people, you can do entirely whatever you want. We don't call on you for anything with respect to the atomic bomb. Just please no longer get in the way. He was a concert pianist. He was a truly extraordinary human being, but I say this again, the darkness of his spirit. If you bring a dark spirit to these things, that notion will fulfill itself. Who was it who said, it was Henry Stimson, the Secretary of War, one of the great men of our time. He said, if you expect trust, you have to trust. You can't expect trust if you don't show trust. So we didn't show the Soviets trust. When Truman announced the project, I think it was the 18th or 19th of July in Potsdam, he came up after one of the meetings and he said to Stalin, I just wanted you to know we have a kind of really interesting new weapon, just thought you'd like to know. When I heard that, I was so offended. Well, it turns out Stalin knew all about it from the spies, but still, Truman should have said, I need to tell you what has happened, and that this is unprecedented in the history of the world, and we really need to think about this. But instead, he had a glib little statement for Stalin. And Stalin just said, good, I hope you make the best of it. And that was the beginning of the Cold War. Now, I'm not saying there wouldn't have been a Cold War. I'm not naive, I think. But you have to practice the arts of hope. You have to show optimism in the face of the cruelty and the madness of the world, because if you don't, there is no chance that we can lift humanity to a higher ethical plane. And so even if it's a fool's errand, if it's quixotic, we have to try. And if we had agreed to share secrets with the Soviets, who had them anyway, they wouldn't have reacted with their massive emergency paranoia, wouldn't you, if you suddenly learned of a weapon of mass destruction that your enemy suddenly had? And so we lost that opportunity. Teller was essential to the hydrogen bomb, and he eventually made it work. Take another question.
Dr. Oppenheimer, I've not seen the recent film that you seem somehow amazingly to know about posthumously.
You know,
But can you speak to the safety measures taken for the observers, how far they were away? And I'm sure the records aren't nearly as good as they might be, but I wonder about the medical repercussions in the following years.
Yeah, you raised such an important question, sir. We were so fixated on the blast. Could we ignite the energies in the atom, that we really didn't think about radiation. We had some sense of it, of course. We're not without an understanding of how this works. But it wasn't one of our focuses. It wasn't until, I think, April of 1945 where we put together a little team to maybe think about the possible radioactive effects. After the war, of course, we saw what happened to the people who were there and the people who were exposed and the downwinders. But we weren't really thinking about it at the time. We had medical teams, and there were several people who died in the project. But we really were not yet cognizant of the bigger effect of an atomic device. In some sense, the blast is the least of it, and it's the miasma that brings about death in 3 days or 3 months or 30 years, but plants the seed of destruction in everyone that it touches. So I wish we had been able to anticipate that better. We did have plans to evacuate Amarillo if necessary, but the winds were in the proper direction right into the heart of the desert. We were 2,000 feet and sometimes 10,000 yards from the actual site. The bomb was on a 110-foot tower, and we were at all of these places that were concrete reinforced and so on. And we were given welder's glass so we could look at it without being blinded. You will perhaps know that Edward Teller brought suntan lotion and put it all over his body, thinking that that would somehow protect him from radioactive effects. He looked profoundly silly. Just another thing about that, 24 hours before the test, I got a call from George Kistiakowsky, who was in charge of the implosive mechanism. So they'd done a last test on it and it had failed. When he got to Alamogordo, I came up to him and I browbeat him and said, "We've had years to perfect this. How dare you now tell me that this thing isn't going to work?" I regret that. That was unfair of me, and he never really got over that, of course. But he said, "I'll tell you what, Oppie, I'll bet you 1 month of my salary to $10 in your pocket that this thing will work tomorrow." And I said, "I'll take that bet." And when it worked, and we were all in this kind of a daze, he came up to me and said, "Hey, where's my $10? And I was, "Sir, I'll get it to you later," I said. And Kenneth Bainbridge came up and put his arm around my back and said, "Now we're all sons of bitches." I'll do one or two more. Yeah.
You mentioned blood on your hands. Given hindsight, are there alternatives that you realistically view now as would have been preferable?
I went to Japan in 1960. I was invited to come give a series of lectures in Japan, and my advisors and friends said, "Don't do that. This can't be good. The Japanese have every reason to be angry at you and perhaps worse." I said, no, I have to go, I have to go. So I went, and you know the Japanese treated me with extraordinary graciousness. And I was giving a little press conference at the Tokyo airport before I flew back to the United States, and one of the reporters said, Dr. Oppenheimer, do you regret today any more than ever now that you've been here? And whoever wants that question? I said, well, I don't regret it any more than I did yesterday, and I don't suppose I regret it any more than I will tomorrow. But what I didn't say is, who could have done this without being haunted by it? I mean, as I said at the beginning, it would have been done if I'd never been born. But I was the one who vaporized 60,000 people in an instant. These were men, women, and children going to work. There had been some air raid sirens earlier in the day, and the all clear had come, and these were civilians taking their children to school or people going to work, and they had, of course, they hadn't the slightest clue what this would be. They had seen bombs where an apartment complex is blown up or a factory, but nobody could have anticipated this, and suddenly a flash of light, and it's like a scene out of Dante's Inferno or the Apocalypse. So how you go on. Science was going to do this thing. Science can't be stopped. It's not for scientists to make policy. Scientists show what can be done, and politicians and statesmen make policy. Although I did say after the war, things are now so complex that we can't trust the politicians anymore. Either the politicians have to become scientists or the scientists have to become politicians, and you do the math. I said once, in a way that cannot be exaggerated or defended by vulgarity or humor, scientists have known sin. I don't mean that in some sort of sentimentalist, mawkish way, but the sin of hubris, the sin of pride, we realized we could open the center foundation of the universe and play with its energies. And we didn't stop for a second. We just did it, because that's what humans do. So of course, I felt remorse, but you have to go on. You have to go on. You can't collapse in the face of this. And I tried to use all of this energy, this remorse, this guilt, this hauntedness, to create conditions under which there would be international agreements to limit this thing. So in other words, if you turn that into some understanding of how to prevent World War III, that's all you can do in the face of this, because if the United States hadn't built the bomb, Germany would have later, France would have later, China would have later, England. What we had was an industrial plant that no other country had, but the physics are available in a modest encyclopedia. Same time in Japan, another journalist said, Dr. Oppenheimer, do you think we can put the genie back in the bottle? And I said, no. This is now imprinted in the imagination of warring man for the future of the planet Earth. And it's only going to get more sophisticated. I said, but if we all work with unprecedented attempts at moral understanding and teaching ethics and realizing the implications of human mechanical and scientific ingenuity, if we all rise to a higher level of human maturity, we might possibly put the big toe of this thing back in the bottle. So, I don't know the answer, because that secret once known is not only known by great nations and scientists, but it's known by pirates and rogues and terrorists. I think, to tell you the truth, you have been living on borrowed time. Because when the next one is used, it will so normalize and routinize that weapon that after that, I think, the idea of nuclear restraint will be a mere fantasy. Do we have time for one more or no?
If you can answer concisely, Dr.
I cannot, sir.
Thank you. Wonderful presentation. Did the United States have additional nuclear weapons, and was there a plan?
Oh yes, how many did we have? So we had Hiroshima and Nagasaki, and we had 2 more. And by the end of October, we had 4 or 5 more. So we could have continued. And the reason that the second one was dropped over Nagasaki was in part to show the Japanese that we could continue this as long as necessary. It wasn't really true. Fortunately, they surrendered. But the idea was we didn't want them to think that this was some sort of a one-off thing that couldn't be repeated. Yeah, and I will say this too, and this is another, perhaps an indictment of the scientific spirit, but remember the test was the implosion device at Alamogordo, and it worked. I mean, we were shocked. A device like this should probably not work the first time. The bomb at Hiroshima was a gun mechanism uranium bomb. It worked. But in some limited sense, we wanted to try the plutonium bomb over a Japanese city too to see what its destructive perimeter was. And so there's a scientific dynamism that in some ways corrupts our moral sense.
Dr. Oppenheimer, thank you for your time this evening.
Right, thank you. Thank you.
And as we thank Dr. Oppenheimer, we welcome to the stage humanities scholar and dear friend of the Vail Symposium, Clay Jenkinson.
You know, I just want to say about 5 minutes worth. I know I'm keeping you from that fine wine. And Oppenheimer, by the way, was a great lover of wine. So thank you for being here. I've been so looking forward to this. Oppenheimer, I do like 9 historical characters. Oppenheimer is far and away my favorite because he's a truly tragic character. You know, Aristotle's definition of tragedy is that the tragic persona, the protagonist, is in some ways complicit with his fall. And clearly Oppenheimer was in some respects complicit with his fall. But I also love, I first got interested in Oppenheimer when I read, 15 or 20 years ago that he said, "I am become death, the shatterer of worlds." And I thought, who does that? Who talks that way? So I said, I want to know why this man brought that to, and see, this is what I live for, my friends. Truly. Not only trying to solve mysteries like this, but using the humanities to make sense of the almost impossible complexity of life. We're perplexed and we're divided and we're confused and we're numbed by overstimulation. But the humanities, in this case the Bhagavad Gita, or it could be the poetry of John Donne, or it could be Shakespeare's Hamlet or King Lear. But those great texts give us a matrix with which to try to wrestle with life. And I mean no disrespect, but you can't do it on Netflix. This has to be Dante, this has to be King Lear, this has to be Paradise Lost, this has to be Crime and Punishment, Madame Bovary, Sense and Sensibility, Pride and Prejudice. And so the humanities, when they, on those occasions when they effervesce and connect with enormous human events. I would not have started down the Oppenheimer road if he had just said, wow, great day, bomb worked, let's get some lunch. But he said, I am become death. Who says that? Who talks that way? If you've ever seen him on NBC in 1965 on the 20th anniversary, he has this haunted face, remember that? He looks like a ghost. And then he says that thing that I quoted, some laughed, some cried, and so on. And I've wondered for years, is there any posturing in that? Is there any way in which he was playing Oppenheimer? I don't think so. I think this was Oppenheimer. Amazing that he went on and that he succeeded so greatly after the war. And if I get to choose which world I want to live in, I want to live in Oppenheimer's world, not Edward Teller's. I want to live in a world where someone is so ethically full that she or he brings something extra to these questions. And man, are we missing it now. Man, are we missing it now. So anyway, outside, the bookworm has copies of American Prometheus. I've read it many times. If you've seen, how many of you have seen the film? I hope you will go see it again. I've seen it 3 times. The 3rd time was a mistake. I drove all the way from Bismarck to Billings to see it on IMAX. And it turned out it was baby IMAX. Where you've ever been to baby IMAX? It's just a little extra popcorn. And so anyway, but I loved it, all 9 hours of it. And I went to it. I went to it on the first day, came to my home in Bismarck. I was at the theater at 11:40 a.m. for the 12 o'clock start. The theater's doors were locked. So there I was, and of course it was the same day as you-know-what, Barbie. And KFYR TV was there with, and saying, why are you here? Why are you here? And all these people were like, oh, I've waited my life. This is such a dramatic moment. This is maybe the best thing that's ever happened. I can't wait to see Barbie. And then this 22-year-old reporter said to me, are you here to see Barbie? And I said, no, I'm here to see Oppenheimer. And he said, no, I'll find somebody else. So I sat there and watched it, and I was absolutely just mesmerized. And I went planning to shake my fist at the screen because I knew it would be filled with Hollywood craziness. You know what Hollywood does. And I thought, I'm just going to hate this. And I took a notebook, I was all nerded out. And it is spot on historically. Now, mentioned before, Louis Strauss is overplayed. But I'll tell you this, if Robert Downey Jr. doesn't win the Academy Award for Best Supporting Actor, there is no justice in the world. That was one of the most powerful performances I have ever seen in my life. Emily Blunt was great. Cillian Murphy was great. Matt Damon, he was playing Matt Damon. And Matt Damon is too sweet to be Leslie Groves. But I absolutely loved it, and if you haven't seen it, I urge you to see it. But it helps if you read the book first. Because it's like a Dostoevsky novel. There's so many, I know a lot about this, and there were all sorts of people I couldn't identify. Remember when MTV had those bubbles? And it would say, this is somebody, somebody, somebody. We need it for this film. But it's worth seeing. In fact, it's worth seeing again. Absolutely stunning. And as you know, and I'll close with this, and we can talk privately over wine, that Vladimir Putin is saber-rattling about using a nuclear weapon in the field. It wouldn't be dropping it on London or Kyiv. I think he would use a small battlefield device, and they're very much smaller than what we might imagine. But Oppenheimer's point was, if you use a third one, the doors swing open, and you can say sayonara to the human condition. So it's in our interest as a nation to remember that, because one of the best pieces of advice I ever got was from a friend of mine. We were having trouble with somebody. He said, never back someone into a corner out of which he can only get by going over the top of you. And I think Vladimir Putin is very close to that corner. And I think it's in our interest to find a way to step back from the brink and not let Ukraine go down, of course. At any rate, I just absolutely love the film, and I love the resurgence in Oppenheimer. The other book I would just quickly recommend is A Life in Twilight, The Final Years of Robert Oppenheimer. And that's about see it now and when he became a cult figure, and it's just an unbelievable story of the resurgence of the human spirit. So let's stop. You have some handouts, and we'll go have wine.
Ladies and gentlemen, Clay Jenkinson.